My name is Norm Volsky, your host, and this is the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast.
Thanks, Norm. It's an honor to be here, and it's been fun to work with you over the years.
Hello, and welcome to the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast with your host, Norm Volsky. And today we are thrilled to be joined by Emily Durfee, partner at Healthworx Ventures. Emily, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. So for all of our listeners and viewers that are unaware, Healthworx Ventures is a venture firm focused on making healthcare better for all. Emily is dedicated to fostering innovation and enhancing healthcare accessibility, quality, and equity. She's played a key role in establishing 1501 Health, empowering startups to break through healthcare industry barriers. Emily brings an extensive experience in problem solving across startup ventures, impact investing, and technology consulting. Previously, Emily was an investment manager at the Optimizer Foundation, product operations manager at Clover Health, and a consultant at Vera Solutions. With an MBA from the University of Oxford and a bachelor's from Georgetown, Emily is deeply committed to driving impact, leveraging technology, and continuously refining strategies to tackle challenges. We're so excited to learn from your incredible career, spanning the globe from Senegal to Mumbai to Kenya and now Washington. So thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Today I happen to be in Baltimore, so just adding even more cities to the list.
You're a world traveler. I love it. So Emily, you got a really interesting background. What inspired you to work in venture?
Yeah, absolutely. So I took one of those roundabout paths to venture. I say I have one of those like quote unquote non-traditional backgrounds, which like depending on who you are is either a compliment or an insult. I like to think it's a compliment, clearly, because it's the choices that I've made. But, fundamentally, I've always been in the startup space. I joined a startup directly out of college, and I think just really loved the work. I am the type of person who loves throwing a lot of things at the wall, seeing what sticks, moving quickly. And so being able to work in that environment is something that fit for me at age 22 and continues to really resonate with me now. And after being kind of in an operating role at multiple startups, what I realized is being able to take a step out of the day-to-day and being able to empower other entrepreneurs to be successful is something that felt really exciting to me. And I think that called me into venture. I'm not a traditional finance person. I hesitate to say that it's probably not my greatest skill set. But I think that being able to understand what entrepreneurs go through on a day-to-day basis and how to operate a business from the inside out enables me to still make good decisions and help the folks that I work with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, no, I think there's plenty of people from a finance background in venture. So, one less isn't like the worst thing in the world. And two, I think when people invest at an individual level, always the advice is diversification, diversify your, risk and invest in a lot of different things and spread it out. What's interesting is in venture, sometimes venture capitalists want the other investors they're investing with and co-investing, they want them all to be homogenous. They want them to be just like them. And that's not giving the founder a lot of diversity of thought. If everyone has the same background and they come from the same way of thinking, then all the investors are good at the same thing. And maybe they don't have strengths in other areas and they're getting a lot of horsepower in one specific area. And, that could really, hold a company back from achieving, a ton of success. So I think having investors with different backgrounds and different skill sets and, different strengths is a really good thing. And if I was an entrepreneur, I'd want investors that are good at different things. So I see it as a positive.
I hope so. I think the other piece of this, for what it's worth, building onto that I think is really interesting is corporate venture capital is a slightly different beast than institutional venture capital, right? And I think that also creates diversification because when you have an investment from me and from Healthworx, right, we're in the investment and innovation arm of CareFirst Blue Cross Blue Shield. So we are able to actually bring the resources and subject matter expert of that payer perspective to the table as we make investments and support those investments. And I think that means that fundamentally my work exceeds just what I can provide. I like to think of a lot of venture capitalists as kind of a point of power, right? How do you aggregate networks, understanding, curiosity, even just how raw, smart, intelligent you are into the work that you do. And my position is significantly less about me and significantly more about what doors can I open and how can I create like a pipeline of power between folks as opposed to being that aggregation of power in the middle. And I think like that is something that I really enjoy doing and also kind of takes the pressure off me a little bit because it's not just about how great I am because like I'm fine.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm that great, right? But it is about like how great are all of the different doors that I can open across the space.
No one can accomplish anything on their own. You need a
Yep.
village, you need a network, and the stronger your network is, the stronger your relationships are. That's what will determine, a person's success and their company's success. So tell us about your experience as product operations manager at Clover Health.
Yeah. It's a title that doesn't really mean anything, right? You're like, what is that? Please explain. So,
Yeah.
for anyone who doesn't know, right, Clover Health is kind of one of those neo payers that focus specifically on the Medicare Advantage market. I actually don't know exactly what the scale is anymore. It's been a decade or so since I worked
Hmm.
there. But I joined when it was a relatively small team and it grew substantially while I was there. I think when I joined, we were, 100 and change maybe. And it was, I think, 600 people by the time I left 2 years later. So it was a time of really, really rapid growth for the business. And we were solving a lot of problems. We were encountering and solving a lot of problems, just like most startups do. And the way that I think about the solutions to any problem, right, is there is a spectrum of solutions from fully manual to fully technical, right? So you can have
Hmm.
a team of people doing something on a very manual basis on one side of that, right? You can have a fully automated, AI driven solution on the other side. And then there are a lot of things in the middle where you have humans using a technology system to improve and create more efficiency in operations.
Yep.
And so when I think about my role, I often worked very closely with a product manager, and I was the one who was responsible for everything kind of on the most manual to like 2/3 down the way side,
Hmm.
right? And then the product managers were the most technical, kind of moving the other direction. And so it was just how do you figure out what the right type of solution is, whether it's technical or operational to any problem, and then how do you implement it as quickly as possible so that you can move on to the next problem that you're facing as a startup.
And what did product operations manager mean at Clover? What were you doing?
So, built out a customer service escalations team for kind of
Hmm.
complicated challenges that some of our members were facing. I also built out and supported our contracting and credentialing and provider data teams. We launched a new internally built technology program and hired and trained a team to be able to leverage that program to do those kinds of ins and outs of payer operations. And then the last project that I worked on, I worked with our kind of home-based team. So we had a group of community folks who were able to go door to door or show up at events or
Hmm.
otherwise be present in the communities that we served to be able to supplement the more clinical work that we did. Because turns out, even if you have all the clinical resources in the world, if you don't know how to reach people and they're not engaged with your solution, it doesn't actually matter what you're doing. And
Yeah.
so building out what that looks like and how you can leverage that towards kind of acute chronic conditions.
What were your biggest challenges and successes over at Clover?
Um, I think to start with challenges and then successes, right? Like that type of rapid growth is incredibly complicated.
Hmm.
It is complicated when it comes to what your operations look like. It is complicated when it comes to decision making, to team dynamics, to culture, to all of those different pieces. And so when I think about challenges, it wasn't the like, how do we do X thing in Y number of days? It was the how do we make sure that we're consulting with the right people, bringing the right people around, still moving quickly, and continuously navigating very different and evolving team
Hmm.
dynamics, right? And I think that was awesome. I got to work with a lot of really, really smart, really cool people there
Hmm.
because I had the opportunity to work in all of these different changing dynamics. But it certainly took a fair amount of emotional intelligence, and I was in my mid 20s and maybe have limited emotional intelligence at the time, and so certainly had to grow a lot myself as well. I think the other piece, talking about the opportunities and successes, right? I mean, we cared for people. Ultimately, on the macro level, we were able to grow our membership base and we were able to improve the way that they were able to access care. And at that point, right, it was a lot, mostly, or I think only folks in the New Jersey area, often people who weren't necessarily from particularly privileged backgrounds.
Hmm.
And so being able to offer differentiated ways that they could access care and have preventative medicine and like be healthier and live better lives, like
Hmm.
is really important. And then I often think about impact on the micro level too. I think that sometimes we can't control exactly the value that we drive through the businesses that we work with, but we can make sure that the people who we work directly with as individuals benefit from being next to us, right? So how do you hire and give chances to people who are just incredibly talented but haven't necessarily been given those opportunities? How do you coach? How do you mentor? How do you empower? And while I certainly in my 20s was not a perfect leader, and frankly, I don't even think now I'm a perfect leader, it's something that I think was a success that I'm really proud of being able to support, lead, hire, and sometimes find new roles for the people who I worked directly with.
Yeah. Well, other than my wife and my mother, no one's perfect.
Yeah.
So, just throwing that out there. Um, so don't be too hard on yourself. What was it like, leading 3 teams with a total of 30 people reporting up to you? Like, any tips on leadership and how to build a great culture?
Ooh. I think like that was a really interesting experience for me because there were different skills leading direct reports versus teaching your direct reports how to be leaders themselves,
Hmm.
right? And so I think a lot of what that looks like is first of all just hire right. I think I have learned over and over again that like hiring the right people, even if it takes a little bit longer, even if it means that I'm juggling 4 jobs at the same time while I'm doing it, is like always the right choice. And
Hmm.
finding people who have the same values but act on them differently, because if you have a team of only homogenous folks, then like you're going to have pretty significant blind spots. If you have people who are exceptionally different than you, right, and like I think there may be some culture clashes and challenges, but if the goals that you have are the same, right, the ways that you want to interact are the same, and then the tactics that you use are different, it feels like it's the right balance. And then I feel like it is a lot of trying to help people actually discover who they are, right?
Hmm.
I think especially when you're leading leaders, but also when you're leading anyone, right? Like you're not trying to shape mini me's, right? Like if your goal is just to have other yous going out and doing the same thing, then like you're probably not doing it right.
Hmm.
But if you are instead trying to authentically get to know the people who you're working with and say, who do you want to be as a leader? What works for you? What doesn't? What is authentic to you? How can you start at the core of what works for you as a human and then add additional skills so that you can increase your abilities over time, but not necessarily just try to transport yourself into being someone else who you really aren't, because you're not going to do it successfully, and B, you're going to burn out, right?
Yeah.
I think that that's something that I had to learn quite a bit of, shrinking my own ego and letting someone else take center stage, listening to who they were and like celebrating them for themselves.
Yeah, I think people are able to reach their potential when, they can truly be themselves in work and life. And that's great that like you want these people that work with you to be like their authentic selves and all of like the advantages and disadvantages that brings, not just fit into your box, which is, really, really insightful. What are 3 qualities you look for when hiring a team?
Yeah, so it's funny. We're going through an interview process right now, so I think about this a lot. And I promise I'll go back to your question, but like just to kind of take a step back, the way that I
Hmm.
think about it at a high level is in venture capital, no one has every single skill that is required to be good at it, right?
Yep.
Like no one understands technology and healthcare and like for us navigating corporate systems and relationship building and financial modeling, right? Like no one is really good at every single thing.
Hmm.
And so what we need to do is we need to be a team that someone on that team has that spiky skill, not necessarily everyone, and that everyone is both skilled enough in what they're good at to teach it and
Hmm.
humble enough to learn it regardless of who is teaching them. It can be someone above at the same level or below you. Like we still have an opportunity to learn from each other. And so like I think of this as kind of this like right now I feel like I'm playing like hiring Tetris where I'm trying to like fit the pieces together to make sure that all of the different things that we need are covered. And what I'm looking for are people who have at least 1 or 2 of those spiky skills. Beyond those spiky skills, right, characteristics, I think respect is incredibly important in a team. And I don't mean respect as in like, let's be nice to each other. Like, but I mean it in the sense that every single person on the team is truly adding value and is seen as valuable to the team. And
Yeah.
so when someone speaks up, people are excited to hear what they have to say because they believe what they are saying is very likely to be value adding to the conversation. And if it is not, it's because someone has something to learn, and that's great too, right? Like, let's go. And so I think that is that kind of respect and value is something that I really look for in characteristics of people who I bring on a team. I think like I put together to a certain extent authenticity and warmth.
Hmm.
Like I want to know who you are, and I want to feel connected to you. I'm not sure I buy into the whole like work has to be a family thing, but like
Yeah.
I do want to know how your weekend was. I want us to have a basic understanding of who we are as humans. My colleague often says that our team is a group of misfits. And so I think the third characteristic that I'm looking for is someone who is confident enough in themselves that they've done something weird. Like it can be a hobby, it can be they moved somewhere else, it could be that they took an interesting job. But are you someone who has enough self-confidence that you've thrown yourself in the deep end into something because you freaking love it? Is
Hmm.
something that I think I'm looking for, because I think that that is something that we often see in entrepreneurs. And if you can't relate to that, I'm not necessarily sure you can build fully connecting relationships with the people who we are supposed to be serving.
Yeah. If they don't have that, they should go to private equity, once it doesn't need that entrepreneurial spirit necessarily.
Yeah. Or many other things, right? But I just like boldness is something I
Mhm.
celebrate in people, boldness and
That's great.
bravery.
What inspired you to move from the product world at Clover to being an investment manager at the Optimizer Foundation?
Yeah. So in between, I did my MBA.
Hmm.
And I started my MBA believing that I wanted to start a business. I got approximately 10 days into my MBA before I realized that was probably not right for me. Not
Hmm.
because I think I will never necessarily start a business, but because I think like the amount of time and energy and frankly, often identity that gets sunk into starting a business is something that is pretty significant. And I'm not necessarily sure that I wanted at that time or even now want to take on. And so then I kind of had to start from square one. I was like, well, I've got a 1 year MBA program. I need to figure out what I want to do next and how I can leverage this time most effectively. And fundamentally, right, as I was thinking about my goals, which was to improve the ways that entrepreneurs can function, can access resources, can connect with networks, et cetera, it felt like accelerators slash consultancy agencies slash investing would be the best way of doing that. And I
Hmm.
wish I could tell you that like it was definitely investing and I came up with a specific reason, but like that was where I got a job. So that is then what I did. I knew I wanted to be in the enablement space, and that was the first group that took a chance on me.
And talk to me about the experience in both East and West Africa.
Yeah, so I moved to Kenya right after undergrad when I was 22. I spent a couple of years there, then moved to West
That
Africa
takes
to Senegal.
boldness, I must say.
Yeah, it was like the classic like startup experience. So we were building toilets that were converting waste in informal settlements in Nairobi in Kenya. And we had this like very quintessential startup experience where like we were all staying in the same house. We didn't have any furniture, so we like worked on mattresses on the floor of this house. We tested concrete in our driveway, and then we turned our generator house, which we didn't have a generator at the time, into an outhouse so that we could use it when we needed to go to the bathroom so that we could actually test like our fertilizer products.
Yeah,
And it was
wow.
like, I feel like
Talk
the most
about getting in
classic.
the weeds and rolling up your sleeves, get your hands dirty. Like that's it to a T.
Right? I know. It was the most ridiculous like 22-year-old experience. I was supposed to only be there for 3 months, and then I had a job doing consulting back in the States. And spoiler alert, never came back to the States to do that consulting job and stayed for 2 years instead. So I lived there. Then I moved to Senegal for about a year, spent some time in Mali as well. We had offices in both places, and then moved back to Kenya for a few months before I moved to India. And that all kind of follows. I studied abroad in Ghana when I was an undergrad. I was an African studies minor. I lived in South Africa when I was a kid. And so I think like all of that kind of translates into, feeling really deeply connected to the continent. And at least even in my experience as a kid in South Africa, right, it was very much the like, how do we bring our resources together to make something better? And so I think that that was something that was really important to me. And frankly, I still to this day, if my life were different, wish I could live in Nairobi. It is my favorite place I've ever lived. I've moved there 3 times, which should say something about like how sticky it is. And
Yeah.
I think just like the quality of the people there and the hustle that they all have. Again, you're probably starting to get the impression like I like people who fight a little bit, right?
Hmm.
And Nairobi as a city is a hustling city, and I have deep respect, sometimes frustration, but also deep respect for that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you've lived, in multiple different countries outside of the US. What have you learned in some of your experience navigating like healthcare systems in other countries, and like how can we learn from them and apply certain things that they do well that you think the US doesn't do well?
Yeah. So I mean, I've been lucky, right? Like I invested in different countries in Africa. I spent some time talking to the NHS while I was in grad school in the UK, and then being a part of the healthcare system here in the US. It's interesting. The challenges are almost always the same. They just look a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
How do you engage people in healthcare? Like, how do you even reach them and access them? Sometimes it's because like there literally just like aren't roads or like no internet access or whatever. But sometimes it's also because people have been historically excluded from or even injured by healthcare systems, right? That means that they don't necessarily want to be a part of it. And so how do you actually make people want to even talk to you
Hmm.
as a healthcare provider, I think is kind of the first challenge that exists across the globe. I think the second thing is, do you have the right number of physicians to be able to care for the population that you have? And like, while there are certainly even worse supply demand dynamics in, most of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, like we have it in the States too. They have it in the UK. Like there, I think, are very few countries where there are actually enough clinicians for the number of people who need help, especially as we're seeing the rising dynamics of chronic conditions and lifestyle diseases that are coming up across the world.
Hmm.
And then the third thing, right, is like, will people actually do the thing you tell them to do? Are they going to eat the right things? Are they going to take the medicines, et cetera? There are lots of barriers there that I think make it really difficult and like exist kind of regardless of where you are. And so I think like the ways that humans experience healthcare is actually relatively similar across the world. The thing that is
Yeah.
really, really different is who pays for it
Mhm.
and what therefore are the incentives. And so you talk to folks at the NHS, right? And like, because you have a nationalized insurance system that takes you from basically birth to death, if it is done correctly,
Mhm.
you have much more incentive to try to create preventative healthcare for folks earlier on, because you expect in 30 years, when this actually comes to pass, like you will still benefit from it.
Yeah.
Whereas privatized healthcare in the United States has a very different angle. And, much of sub-Saharan Africa is really much more direct to consumer, right? There's some insurance, but it's like kind of at a acute level as opposed to
Yeah.
any sort of like preventative level. And so like, it is the incentives of like who's paying for it and therefore like why they're paying for it and what they care about that changes, but the actual problems in healthcare are like kind of the same everywhere.
Yeah, no, interestingly enough, my mom's a nurse by background. She was the dean of nursing at a couple colleges, UMass Boston first, and then she finished her career at University of Cincinnati as their dean of nursing. And she went on a like medical mission, a volunteer project in Africa, and my dad tagged along for the ride. And yeah, they came back with just some incredible stories, some heartbreaking, some heartwarming.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just very eye opening for them on what conditions certain people lived with or ailments for long periods of time, and how quick and simple and how little resources were needed to like change their life and change their quality of life and trajectory and their life expectancy. So it was really rewarding for them. And they've since donated to the program that they participated in. So, definitely
Yeah.
remember when they came back with all the anecdotes for sure. Was there any healthcare initiatives you built during your time at Optimizer?
Yeah. So Optimizer doesn't build companies, right? We invested in companies. We
Hmm.
did invest in some healthcare companies. And sorry, you're asking me to pull back a few years into
That's
exactly what we
okay.
looked at. So we invested in a company that does kind of builds clinics and informal settlements in Kenya.
Hmm.
Um, we also, I think that was it. We did more financial and educational investments. We looked at a bunch of healthcare investments at the
Hmm.
time. So can definitely talk about the pros and cons of those if you want. But I think that was the one healthcare related investment. And then actually, right as I was leaving, so I left Optimizer in April of 2020, which is a year that, well,
Wow, that's
we will
a
always
very
remember.
interesting time
Yep.
from
Exactly. And so I think like at the time we were also doing due diligence into other things related to healthcare just because it was, COVID, and
yeah.
healthcare systems had dramatically and needs had dramatically changed even over the course of 6 weeks.
And what inspired you to join Healthworx?
Yeah. So I have the official and the unofficial answers, right?
Hmm.
I think the unofficial answer is it was 2020. The world was shutting down. I wanted to be in DC
Hmm.
because that's where I had a lot of friends, and I wanted to work in the startup ecosystem. And DC doesn't necessarily have as strong, though it's certainly growing, of an
Uh-huh.
ecosystem around startups as others. And so, Care First was the I would say kind of best available option, and it's hilarious because like if you had asked me 4 years ago when I joined if I would still be with the team, I would have laughed you out of the room, right? Like I
Yeah,
thought there was a tiny, tiny chance, and I have loved it.
I love that.
I
That's
think
great.
that I know, right? Like having access to the experts that we have in this office and on this team, like I have found my people, I found the champions across the organization. Like it is such an incredible resource, and like I've been kind of shocked by how amazing it has been. All that said, right? Like the official answer also stays true, which is like when I said, like when I even interviewed at the time, right? I was like, there are three
Mhm.
things that I need in a job. The first is that I really need to be able to have a job where I'm learning every day, right? Where like, let's
Yep.
say 40% of the things I do, I'm already good at and I'm adding value. And 60% of the things that I do, I am learning new skills at, right? And like, I thought that running an accelerator program in the US around healthcare would do that. To be clear, it really did do that. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
I think I'm still learning. The second thing is I wanted to work with people who I liked and respected. I think that that's the thing that makes you enjoy your work. And it's
Mhm.
interesting, actually, at the time when I took this job, I had a few other offers. And I liked the people here the most, right? The people who
Mhm.
interviewed me just felt like people who I was like, I think I'm going to like you. I think I'm going to really learn from you. And that came true.
Mhm.
And then the third thing was like having a mission that like on the
Yeah.
hours, days, weeks, months, when like work just kind of sucks, right? Because that
Mhm.
happens sometimes,
Yeah.
that it feels like it's still worth doing. And working in healthcare, and like, I think privatized health insurance can be complicated, and sometimes controversial. I think being able to work with people who are incentivized to try to improve outcomes while decreasing cost of care is in fact significantly aligned with the values that I have. And so I think it's been kind of all of those things have been true. And so while like in the chaos of 2020, I didn't necessarily think that this would be a long-term decision. I had no idea. It seemed unlikely. I was going from a company of 3 people to a company of 7,000 people, right?
Mhm.
The reasons I chose it as the best of the options I had have actually turned into and blossomed into incredible opportunities for me.
That's great. Walk us through your focus in your job.
Yeah, absolutely. So to be frank, right, the focus changes all the time because
Yeah.
if we're not moving quickly, then we are falling behind, right? Especially in healthcare and especially in
Very
venture.
true.
When I first joined the team, I was building out our accelerator program, 1501 Health, which we built in partnership with Healthworx Health. I ran that for a couple of years, give or take, and then hired someone who took on the reins from me. She's awesome. Her name is Sue, and moved over to both supporting her and co-leading part of the ventures team, where we invest in slightly later stage companies.
Mhm.
And then a few months ago, took over full leadership of our ventures team and our ventures fund. And so, through each of those different chapters, my priorities and focus has somewhat shifted. My current focus and priority is around hiring from some more folks on our team who I think are
Mhm.
going to be really exceptional in bringing us further towards the goals and the mission that we have. And then I think that looking forward to staffing up that team, empowering that team, and then all of us getting down to the business of finding more companies who are exciting in the space.
That's great. Can you mention by name any of the organizations that either went through your 1501 accelerator program or that you've invested in as portfolio companies in your time over
Yeah,
at
absolutely.
Healthworx?
So I certainly can't list all of them by name, but they're all publicly available, to be
Yeah,
clear. We've had 20 companies go through our accelerator program. And I mean, examples of companies. So we worked with a company called WellSet that creates access to different types of holistic medicine. They actually have a partnership with Care First now, which I'm really excited about.
that's great.
Another company called Health and Her Hue, we're building out a partnership with our community engagement arm. They're focused on how do you make sure that especially women's health is accessible and actually tailored towards folks of color, and so that they're able to actually get the right types of advice for the unique experiences they have.
Hmm.
I think like, and then on the venture side, also multiple investments. I can talk about one of the companies that we most recently closed, which is a company called Positive Development. We just recently closed it. It's actually based in DC, and what they do is provide alternative clinical care to folks and children on with autism spectrum disorder. And I'm really excited about it because it's a condition that is rapidly increasing. We've gone from 1 in 54 children being diagnosed with ASD, even just a few years ago, to 1 in 36 now,
Hmm.
which is kind of astronomically increasing, and very, very expensive care that is given to support those children in ways that isn't necessarily always inclusive. Right. I think that as we continue to move towards embracing neurodiversity as not something that we need to fix, but something that we need to continue to embrace and learn from, and make sure that folks who have that are able to still operate successfully in the world, right? But are able to bring their unique skills to the table and not just try to blend in or change themselves. I think that's something that's really exciting. So positive development is one of many examples. We also invested in a company called SafeRide last year, which I'm really excited about. They do non-emergency medical transportation. So how do you actually make sure that access to transportation is not the thing that stops you from being able to go to the
Well, everyone
doctor?
says the Uber of healthcare, but like that sounds like an actual good comparison, point to that organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And they do partner with Uber in multiple different ways, right? So
That's
I wish I could list all of them. You feel free to go to our website and see all of them because I think they're all pretty freaking great.
Yeah,
But those would be examples that spring to mind.
that's great. So with Healthworx, acting as the investment arm of CareFirst and Blue Cross Blue Shield, can you explain our audience what sets Healthworx apart from other venture firms, and how does that benefit the teams and companies that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So fundamentally, right, is that we all in the venture capital world like to say that we bring differentiated value, right?
Hmm.
Because different companies need different things. That said, what I think we bring is access to knowledge that exists at a payer, right? Access to folks who have had decades of experience in certain regulatory requirements or certain clinical conditions or certain geographic spaces, right?
Hmm.
And that type of access to people who can just share their insight and knowledge, I think is pretty rare in the ecosystem. The way that I think about it is like startups and kind of institutionalized healthcare often, run on different rails. And I think like being able to build bridges and break down walls between those different groups is really, really critical. Some companies already have it. So for some companies, frankly, like we might not bring differentiated support. And I think that's okay and also important to be transparent about too. But
Yeah.
what we have found is for many companies, being able to access that expert knowledge is really,
Mhm.
really helpful. So we've been really, really grateful to be able to partner so closely with CareFirst.
Yeah, really, really helpful. For us to kind of wrap our minds around like why Healthworks is really, really special. What are five or so crucial traits a founder must have to succeed in healthcare? That's very specific to this market as opposed to other industries.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that everyone listening to this podcast already knows this, right? But healthcare is an incredibly regulated space. And it is not only incredibly regulated, but it is incredibly complicated in that there are multiple different groups who all have very unique incentives who are all acting on the system. And so I, generally speaking, like to support folks who have experience in healthcare and therefore have really, really deep understanding of what all of those incentive structures are. And even if they don't have experience, and frankly, even if they do have experience, I think people who are incredibly curious and flexible. And I use flexible with some level of like hesitancy because part of being an entrepreneur is believing in what you are building, doing that thing, right? And not letting
Mhm.
people sway you far off that. However, if you have a specific goal that you're pointing towards, being able to be curious about how to get there based on what you're hearing from different places in the market, I think is really critical. If you believe you know the answer, I don't think there's anyone in healthcare who actually knows the answer, right? Like you can
Mhm.
spend 40 years in it, and I'm still not sure you actually know all of the answers in it. So
Yeah.
I think that level of like curiosity and some level of flexibility without losing yourself to others is really, really critical. So healthcare experience, some level of like flexibility and curiosity. I think it gets lost sometimes, but team leadership, right? Like being able
Mhm.
to actually attract the right people and empower them, like very, very quickly. The work that we do should grow beyond what we ourselves can accomplish. And
Yep.
if you can't effectively empower people to do that work, then it's going to be very, very difficult to actually scale your business successfully, right? So I think that leadership ability is really critical. Going into the cliche, right? Like grit is, I would still agree, incredibly important. Like things
Mhm.
are hard. Building a company is really freaking
Healthcare is
hard.
really hard.
It's really, really freaking hard, right?
Yeah.
And so I think being able to do that and like hopefully as you mature, right? And I don't necessarily like I'm not painting that to a specific age because I'm not sure that it is related to an
Yeah.
age, but as you mature, being able to both feel the grit in building the thing, but also not attach your entire identity and self to it, and being able to like still celebrate who you are as a human outside of that, I think is really, really critical. And then judgment in knowing what you can outsource and what you must do yourself.
Mhm.
Because
So
I think
delegation is a very important skill to have for a healthcare founder.
Delegation, and delegation not only within your own team, but right, like what are the mission critical bottlenecks that you must be able to be good at yourself, and what things
Mhm.
can you like ask for help or cut corners or like build Frankensteins? Like you have to make sacrifices if you're going to successfully build a business, but the judgment to be able to figure out which sacrifices to make along the way
Mhm.
is often, I think, the thing that yields between successful and failure.
Yeah. Right now is a very unique time for early stage companies to seek investment and get new investors into the fold and have them write checks. So, what advice would you give a startup founder that is going into an investor pitch? Like any tips and tricks? And are there any pitches you heard that you were just blown away and like you still remember it to this day of like, oh, I remember when this company pitched me and like it blew me away?
No, I cannot think of a single one. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I just like pitches are relatively straightforward and like I
Yeah.
don't mind the formula, right? Experimentation is great when it comes to what you're building and like what your
Mhm.
business does and how it solves problems. But like often, frankly, when I'm listening to a pitch, I'm just listening for a few kind of critical things that like
Yeah.
I need answered. And like while I'm certainly curious about your personal investment into the solution, how you've thought about it, all those things. Like, I also just really need to know, like, what does your company do? What problem are you solving? Who are you selling to? Like, how much
Mhm.
money are you making? Right? Like the basics. And so I guess like what I would say in some ways is like, figure out a way of showcasing your true passion on something while
Mhm.
also giving investors the information they need to figure out if it is the right fit for their fund. Um, the worst pitches, on the other hand, right, are people who tend to be like much more like trying to name drop or trying to really leverage networks as opposed to just telling me like, what do you do? Because it's
Yeah.
great if you know X person, but like if I don't understand what your business does, I can't take you anywhere.
Yeah.
Right?
That's really, great advice. What is a not
I actually,
so
to be clear, I'm not sure it is great advice. I'm pretty sure I'm just saying what everyone else does. So I'm just repeating like the standard fare.
yeah. What's a not so obvious red flag in a potential investment that you are looking for to ideally eliminate?
Great question. I think in healthcare specifically, it is not understanding why your customer cares about your thing as one of their top 5 problems. I
Mhm.
feel like we will often either see folks who are like, oh, we can sell to everyone. Now we're selling to employers, but then we're going to sell to payers, and then we're going to sell to providers. And I'm like, well, those are very, very different organizations that care about very different things. First of all, like, who is your customer? What do they care about? And why do they care about you? And then, second of all, why is it a top 5 problem? Because I think, for example, we often hear, like, in the payer side, people will come and be like, well, we're reduce cost of care. And I'm like, that's great. We want to reduce cost of care. We also need to make sure that we are hitting the biggest cost buckets first because like we cannot in fact go through procurement and manage partnerships with 150 different startups that all somewhat
Mhm.
reduce cost of care. And so being able to articulate for whom your solution is kind of a top 5 value prop for, I think that that is something that I don't often hear and the thing that I am most looking for. And sometimes people don't initially pitch it, and that's okay. But if they don't know the answer to it, then it's a challenge.
Mhm. I think great venture folks are really good at both sourcing and evaluating deals. How do you and your team do both?
Yeah. So I think of our sourcing pipeline as actually being 2 separate funnels. So there's the one funnel that comes from our corporate partners who talk to folks in the market all the time and are like, oh, yeah, I've been looking at solutions in X place and here are like a few options that have popped up, right?
Mhm.
And then the second is the very traditional venture way of like, go to conferences, meet investors, meet startups, just continuously trying to
Mhm.
build as much pipeline as possible, right? And we tend to run both of those pipelines in parallel because both of them are super important to us. When it comes to diligencing, like I think 50% of our process is very different than others. 50% is exactly the same. It is
Yeah.
figuring out if it is a good business and a good deal, right? Is the product good? Or is the customer pipeline good? Is the competitive landscape like showcase differentiation, right? Like
Mhm.
all of the things that frankly are like not at all different from any of the other awesome venture capital funds out there. The other thing that we have is both a blessing and a curse, which is working closely with our partners
Mhm.
at Care First in order to figure out if there is strategic value for us.
Yeah.
Partially because we want to make investments that have at least a future opportunity for partnership, if not an immediate opportunity for partnership.
Uh-huh.
But partially because if there is no strategic value for us, then unless they are selling not to payers, but to someone completely different, to providers, to employers, et cetera, if they're selling to payers and we don't think there's value, it's probably a recognition that there's a concern on the business,
That's
right?
a
And so I think there's a fair amount of, I'm not going to call it politics, I'm going to call it relationship building that goes
Mhm.
into that, right? That like as I've gotten to know folks across CareFirst, figuring out who knows about which things and who
Mhm.
is the decision maker on which areas. It's not political, but it is navigation in a
Yeah.
way that takes significant time, effort, and kind of long-term relationship building. But once I have that, right, it enables me to much more quickly figure out if a company is a good idea. Because if we don't think that it has any value for us, probably not worth us
Yeah,
making any sort
your
of
peers probably wouldn't find a ton of value either. Makes a ton of
right.
sense. What is the most unexpected challenge that you've faced in venture?
Yeah, I think a few things on that, right? First of all, and I don't know if this is me facing it, so I'm going to say it and then we can ignore it because it's probably not that interesting, right? Like it is a weird market moment in venture, right? Like we knew that we were in a bubble when it came to prices and valuations in healthcare startups, but like the speed at which that punctured, the kind of speed at which it shifted into unit economics, profitability, some of the like the falls of SVB that we saw, right? Like we are just in this really interesting time that I
Yeah.
think is somewhat unsettled when it comes to what the market is looking for and what that means. I think when it comes to the most unexpected challenges that I have had in venture, I think that it has been two things. The more I know about healthcare, the less I know about healthcare, right? I
Uh-huh.
kept thinking I would like get better at it. And it turns out that like this is just like the rabbit hole that Alice falls down and I am just like in free fall and like I don't
Mhm.
actually know if there is ground. Like I think and so one of the like biggest challenges that I feel like I have faced in venture is like accepting that free fall and embracing it and being able to leverage what I am learning in the process and still continue to be curious and excited about the things that I am not learning instead of moving into imposter syndrome or other types of challenges there. I think the second challenge that I have faced in venture, right, is I think that there's a very interesting experience being a younger queer woman in venture capital. And I think continuing to figure out how to have a voice in that, what that looks like, and how to successfully navigate rooms of lots of different types of people, stay firm in my own voice, and empower like more and more diversity coming after me and after us is
Mhm.
something that I think is, I don't know if it's unexpected, but it certainly has resonated in ways that I didn't expect. And I feel like the ways that I am working on it have shifted as well.
Understood. So I ask everyone who's been on this podcast, we spend our whole professional day in healthcare, but then we have our personal lives.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important that each of us practice what we preach and we, have our own wellness journey. So anything you do to, exercise or reduce stress, that really helps you stay as stress-free as possible in a pretty stressful job.
Norm, you're stealing my last interview question. Let's make sure we don't show this until after I interview all my people. I'm kidding. But my favorite last interview question is always like, who are you as a human outside of your work, right? Because
Yeah.
like I like to think that we're whole humans. So for me, I love exercise. It's definitely how I manage like stress and anxiety in any
Mhm.
situation. I have a lot of different things I love to do. I went on a 40-mile bike ride a couple weeks ago. I spent last weekend down in New River Gorge, which is the national park in West Virginia, rock climbing and going whitewater kayaking. I'm starting my like third year of whitewater kayaking classes tomorrow. And so I think for me, being active and outside are the things that make me feel grounded and whole and human again after
I've been
staring at
there.
screens.
The New River, right?
Yep.
Love it. Yeah, that is a ton of fun for anyone who hasn't been there. Very intense, very fun. So that's great. And then, I think the other thing that a lot of times goes overlooked, everyone says, "Oh, I go to the gym X amount of times a week." But I think the one of the biggest, if not the biggest determining factor of one's health and longevity and quality of life is like what are they putting into their body? And I think
Hmm.
unfortunately in the US, there is temptation everywhere and
Hmm.
really hard to find like good healthy food consistently if you're eating out. So any healthy recipes that you make at home that might inspire someone to try something new?
I am not the right person to ask what I cook. I tend to do the minimum. My inspiration for what it is worth comes from when I'm at home on Saturdays, which is not every weekend. My favorite tradition is every Saturday morning I go to my local farmers market and I
Yeah.
drop off my compost because otherwise I just have an exceptional amount of compost in my freezer. And I figure out what the fresh fruits and vegetables are of that week and I buy them and then I figure out what to do with it. And it is
Oh,
almost
nice.
always some sort of salad because, like, again, cooking is not something I spend a lot of time with, but at the very least, like, it is something that I get a lot of joy out of eating, kind of locally grown, fresh ingredients. And because there's always something different in season, especially, kind of this 6 months, I get to put different types of nutrients on my body on a regular basis.
That's great. Yeah, my wife makes fun of me because we have all these bags in my freezer of like all the carrot
Yeah.
stems and the shavings of like potatoes or
Yeah.
carrots or the ends of the celery or the knobs of the garlic or the onion. And I make my own like broth slash stock, and she makes fun of me. So it's a challenge in our house, but
Yeah.
I'm all about trying to not waste and use every part of the vegetable or fruit or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, Emily, thank you so much for joining and participating in the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast. Thank you for stepping into the ring with me. This was super super helpful. Congrats on all your success, and looking forward to what you and Healthworx continue to do in the coming months and years. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you for joining. Please like, comment, and subscribe below if you enjoyed it.